It's remarkable how times change. Just a few years ago, the desecration of the Terry Fox Monument in Ottawa was like the worst possible thing imaginable. And now that seems mostly left wingers are burning the Canadian flag and chanting death to Canada, we're being told, guys, well, it's not that bad because it's actually not against the law. Why are people upset about this?
Well, this was actually in Vancouver. There was a bunch of clips coming out of this protest where all these pro-Hamas, pro-Hezbollah people got together to chant death to Canada, death to the United States, death to Israel. And they were trying to burn this flag. But I found it so funny because they were trying to burn a polyester nylon flag that wouldn't catch fire. So it's kind of a symbol of the resilience of Canada in the face of all these people who hate it.
Or the mental capacity of the people who do hate it. Isaac, what did you make of what we saw in Vancouver?
Yeah, I thought a lot of things online contrasting these protests, let's call them, by these terrorist sympathizers, as you mentioned, chanting death to Canada and burning the Canadian flag versus, of course, what we saw at the Freedom Convoy, a generally peaceful celebration of Canada. So a lot of clips contrasting those two. And obviously, the Emergency Measures Act was called in on one of those gatherings. You might, if you knew nothing about the situation, guess the wrong one.
Yeah, it's funny. The NDP were, having mental breakdowns over Terry Fox's statue with a Canadian flag on it. They said nothing at all when Palestinian protesters put the Palestinian flag and keffiyeh on the Terry Fox statue. And I'm quite certain that we didn't hear a single thing out of the BC NDP or the federal NDP over the ridiculous protest scenes in Vancouver. I guess that's just the way things are going these days. But with that, let's get into the show. Welcome, everyone, to Off the Record. My name is Harrison Faulkner. I'm joined today by True North's senior journalist and editor, Cosmin Jurja, as well as the host of the Alberta Roundup, Isaac Lamoureux. Gents, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Harrison.
Yeah, thanks, Harrison.
Yeah, we've got quite a lot to get into. This was obviously an insane week in Canadian politics. They kind of just stack up with each other each week. They just kind of get crazier. But of course, with this past week seeing the first anniversary of the October 7th attacks, we knew that it was going to dominate the political dialogue in this country, but maybe not to this same degree. The big news this week, of course, was kicked off when Pierre Poilievre said at an October 7th event and then the following day in Ottawa that he would support preemptive strikes on Iranian nuclear bases and their oil reserves, which is, depending on what you think about it, the reality is this: it's not a sentiment shared by the United States and not one that is shared by the Canadian government. So Poilievre kind of taking a different perspective there, but in kind of line with his hawkish stance on Iran. It then followed when Pierre Poilievre said in the House of Commons that Canada's foreign minister, Melanie Joly, was pandering to Hamas supporters. And the reality is, it doesn't really seem to be too out of step with the truth, because according to Tom Mulcair in CTV, Mulcair said that Joly told him privately that she has to pander to these causes because of the demographics of her riding. Remarkably, we're now in a situation where Canada's foreign policy is being dictated by the demographics of individual ridings. So there you go. We then get Melanie Joly responding to Pierre Poilievre with this hissy fit. Take a listen.
You don't freaking gaslight people. Not on a day that is so important for the country. And clearly that's what Pierre Poilievre was doing today. And clearly what he was saying, he was trying to play petty politics on the backs of victims. And so that's why not only should he apologize for what he did, but clearly the guy's unfit to become prime minister, because Canadians deserve way better.
So there you go. It was, because of what Poilievre said, he was basically removed from the House of Commons and censored by the Speaker, Greg Fergus, for those comments, which frankly aren't that bad if you ask me. I don't know. I mean, he's not saying something that's obviously out of step with the truth. It's just might have struck too close for Melanie Joly and Greg Fergus, so we know is not exactly bipartisan. I want to get through everything we have here. So in response to all of this, and of course the legacy media was melting down right alongside Melanie Joly and saying Poilievre was wrong to make these claims. True North and you, Cosmin, in particular, you fact-checked what was going on with a listicle that explained every opportunity, the 5 times that the Trudeau government has appeased Hamas. And I want to give you the chance to explain that in more detail, Cosmin. So what exactly has the Trudeau government done to appease Hamas?
Sure. First, I just want to point out the double standard of this ruling, because I would take Pierre Poilievre's comments to be fair comment. And here we have the Liberal government constantly accusing the Conservatives of pandering to far-right extremists, domestic terrorists, etc. But those comments are not taken out of line. Nobody's censored for that. So we did put together this list. It was 5 times when the Liberal government clearly pandered to Hamas and its supporters here in Canada. I think the cream of the crop was when a senior Hamas leader actually thanked the Trudeau government alongside other governments, but Canada was chief among that list for his support and calls for a ceasefire. That extends also to votes in the UN by Bob Rae. Additionally, they've supported NDP motions. They've also accused Israel of targeting civilians, ignoring the fact that Hamas often stores ammunition, all sorts of equipment, fighters in civilians' homes, uses civilians as human shields. And all of these things put together just go to substantiate Pierre Poilievre's claims that the Liberal government has, in fact, pandered to Hamas.
Isaac, what do you make of what we've seen?
Yeah, a few things. One thing that stood out to me with Joly's little hissy fit there was she, and I'm guessing did this consciously, did not use the word Hamas, which I found very interesting given the subject she was speaking about. You would think it would come out naturally, especially on October 7th. And then just touching briefly on what Pierre said about Iran there. I don't know that I disagree with him per se, but really I'm looking at these things through the lens of you're either pro-war or against it. So I really don't want to advocate for war in any way. I think that's something Trump did so well, and we'll see with the upcoming American election here, was he kept the world essentially out of wars. He didn't start any new wars. He resolved a few. You'll remember Korea. So really, I want these wars to come to an end. And the best way to do that, of course, is to stop funding these foreign entities.
Well, one thing I think is going to be, people should pay attention to is Pierre Poilievre's changing statements when he eventually does become prime minister, because it's looking very certain that he will be. And I'm pretty certain that when he does become prime minister, he won't be saying that Israel should strike Iran's nuclear bases. You can say that when you're the opposition leader, but there are, falling out of line with the United States foreign policy on the Middle East is not something that Canadian governments typically do. And I think that Poilievre is taking a chance when he's opposition leader to make that point. I think the other thing that I see, which really bugs me, is this fact that we have now let our politics be dictated by the ethnic fights and foreign issues that immigrants mostly care about most. So Melanie Joly admitting to Tom Mulcair there that she has to take certain stances as the Minister of Foreign Affairs because of the demographics of her riding, as if that should have any bearing whatsoever on Canada's best interest. It doesn't. But this is not just the only issue that we've seen this, right? We've seen, for example, different ethnic groups in Brampton dictating Canada's foreign policy when it comes to India, right? This is a major issue, and the same goes likely for China in certain cases, right? Certain members of parliament don't want to make such a strong stance against China because their riding maybe in Richmond is heavily Chinese. So we've now let ourselves into this situation, Cosmin, where Canada's foreign policy is being dictated by small individual riding ethnicities. What a terrible situation for Canada.
Yeah, and I just want to add, it's not just foreign policy. This actually spills out into interethnic conflict that we see played out on the streets. In Calgary, we saw Eritrean gangs fighting each other way back. Recently, we saw a journalist, a South Asian journalist, being attacked on the streets by somebody, part of a different ethnic group in that region, essentially disagreeing with what he had to say and his exposure of extortion schemes within his community. And this is happening all over the place. You mentioned China. We see the Chinese government have agents in this country illegally operating police stations that the government claims have been shut down, but we know that there is still a lot of activity being pushed by the CCP in Canada to pressure, threaten, and intimidate Chinese expats who live in this country, who speak out both privately and publicly against the Chinese Communist government. So it is impacting our foreign policy, but it is also playing out in the everyday lives of Canadians.
And don't you think, Isaac, that members of parliament who are elevated into positions of extreme importance, like being in the cabinet, don't you think that when you're in that position, standing up for the interests of the Canadian people is more important than winning your seat in the next election? Wouldn't you think that that's a reasonable price to pay for standing up for the interests of Canadians?
Yeah, we've seen these MPs that have such an national influence, acting selfishly, if you want to call it that, really just catering to, as you mentioned, a very small demographic. But I guess it comes as little surprise, given so many Liberal MPs in their own ridings are seeing that, based on the polls, they will lose their seats. So these people are thinking, how am I going to keep my job, my salary, my life? Because if I lose my seat, I'm out on the street, essentially, right?
Yeah, it is unbelievable. The last question I have for both of you, and Isaac, you already touched on this, but Cosmin, what do you make of Poilievre's decision to come out so forcefully for Israel to preemptively strike Iran? Like I was saying, my perspective is I think that Poilievre is taking the opportunity as an opposition leader, but in general, I don't think many Canadians want to be dragged into a major war.
Yeah, look, I think he wants to distinguish himself from the Liberal government's lukewarm response. And we know that the foreign policy file has never been the strong suit of the Liberals. So whether you agree with his decision or not, he's taking a stance that is very, single focused, obviously intentional, and has actionable items to it. Whereas the Liberal government just lingers in this this false promise of dialogue, of just essentially going to the UN, and they're not really doing anything. They're not actually pressuring different interest groups involved in this conflict, and they've abandoned Canada's role as this middle power that mediates global conflicts and achieves reasonable solutions that avoid the death toll and the carnage that we see playing out right now.
I couldn't agree more. And we're going to stick with you, Cosmin, because we're going to transition now from foreign policy to provincial politics. I want to go over to British Columbia, your neck of the woods, talk about the state of the race as we're entering, as we get closer to Election Day in British Columbia. There was just a debate. So what's going on in BC? Because it's starting to get a lot of national play.
Yeah, so the election is less than 2 weeks out. We just saw a major debate happen. I think it was the only televised debate actually between the three major party leaders, the BC Conservatives, BC NDP, who are in government, and the BC Greens. But this whole conflict of the Hamas protests and et cetera happening throughout Canada particularly touched BC because we saw in Vancouver on October 7th, a major pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas rally happening. And these clips went viral all over the place, including in the United States, where these protesters, as we mentioned earlier, literally said, we're Hezbollah, we're Hamas, death to Canada, death to the United States, etc. And this sparked a condemnation from BC Conservative leader John Rustad, who came out and said that his official party policy will be to pressure Ottawa, if he gets elected, to deport any non-citizens found to openly and publicly support terrorist groups and terrorist entities. And we know that both Hamas and Hezbollah are listed terrorist organizations here in Canada. And that actually made it into the debate. He was the only leader in that debate to bring this up. And he mentions in a clip that we're just about to play how the BC NDP have continuously pandered to this radical wing of their own party, including by sacking one of their own ministers.
I care about the fact that our youth want to be able to have safety here. You know, we have a government that kicks out a Jewish cabinet minister, Selena Robinson, to appease a mob who last night was burning flags in front of the art gallery. I find that incredibly offensive.
So just for a little bit of context, Selena Robinson was a minister in the BC NDP government. She's Jewish, and she made some comments soon after the October 7th conflict broke out in the Middle East, essentially saying that I think she called the area of where Palestine is a crappy piece of land in an interview. And this caused a huge flood of far left, radical, pro-Hamas pushback from within the BC NDP. And David Eby, essentially the premier, essentially caved to that pressure. And it's outstanding because nobody is calling out the BC NDP's consistent push to appease these individuals within their own party. And we see these protests playing out all the time. They're happening in Victoria, where I live. Every Saturday, there's pro-Palestine people being escorted by police, constantly blocking traffic, saying all sorts of slogans, etc. So I want to ask you, Harrison, how much, because I'm here in BC, this is the story of the year, essentially. How much of this has spilled out to the rest of Canada? Are you seeing conversations about the BC election, and particularly the response from the BC government, which is, I think, a solid one to call for the deportation of people who support terrorists? Is that really reaching the rest of Canada?
You know, the problem, I think, with living in Ontario and specifically living in Toronto is that whatever happens in this area is like the most important news story in the world, and anything else is not thought about, is not talked about, is not discussed. And I think that's almost exclusive to Southern Ontario, that kind of mindset. But I think anyone paying attention to politics in Canada is watching this closely. And they might not have been watching it several months ago, but as the Conservatives get closer and closer to potentially even winning this election, or just putting a major dent into the BC NDP, people are starting to look at this and think to themselves, wow, this is major. This is a major political shift. This is really bad news for Justin Trudeau's Liberals. It's obviously terrible for the NDP. But the one thing that everybody does, at least in Toronto, look at Vancouver and British Columbia, the one thing they look at that for is just the state of the city itself, the problems, because people care more about the problems than they do about what's nice about a certain place. If it bleeds, it leads, that sort of thing. And everybody just understands that Vancouver especially is drug infested. It's full of homeless people, and the policies that have led to that situation have been put in place, for decades, really, but consistently by the NDP. They're the ones that are legalizing cocaine in certain instances, giving out these hydromorphone pills to children, talking about safe. Like basically giving out drugs to kids in BC. It is absurd. So we're not seeing a lot of the dialogue about the election, but everybody understands that the situation in BC is bad and it needs to change. Isaac, what is the situation out in Alberta? Are people paying attention to BC a bit more?
Yeah, obviously, I'm a lot closer to BC than you, Harrison, being their neighbor, their eastern neighbor, but though no one would call Alberta an eastern province. Obviously, I've been paying quite close attention to the BC election, not just because I work for True North, but because I find this provincial election really interesting, especially with the polls, because it's really going to be a nail biter, I think, based on the polls, because really we see the NDP and the Conservatives kind of flipping in each subsequent poll where they're within a few points. So that's really interesting. And I just wanted to talk about the BC provincial election, is not the only provincial election coming up in Canada. We have a few others. And I just really want to see what dominoes will begin to fall if the Conservatives just start cleaning up the provinces, what kind of message that's going to send to the federal government.
Cosmin, I will say this. I not many people are talking about BC election in Ontario, but they are talking about Chip Wilson, the Lululemon founder. This guy seems pretty based. I didn't know about this.
Yeah, so essentially Chip Wilson, he's a big business figure here in British Columbia, and he owns a home in Vancouver. I think that's his base of operations. That's actually where he founded Lululemon, the athletic clothing line. And he put out this huge sign on his property that I guess he had made himself. He got commissioned to be made. And it essentially argued that, the left keeps calling the Conservatives, the BC NDP keeps accusing the Conservatives of being extremists, far right, etc. But they ignore the fact that the BC NDP are communists. And we know the BC NDP is a socialist party. They have their roots in progressive Canadian socialism. And some would argue some of the policies they're introducing, including, mass government subsidized housing in British Columbia, is a form of, communist housing. I come from Romania. I was born there. I immigrated to Canada when I was 7 or 8. We had huge, they were called blocks, but they were essentially giant gray brick buildings where people got to live for free, but you didn't actually get to own the place. And it was essentially a government subsidized place that was offered to you by the Soviet dictatorship at the time. So I think there's some legitimacy, but people were so angry with the sign that they went up there, graffitied it, wrote all kinds of messages on the sign. And it's funny because it just proves that who would get angry at being called a communist other than people who are communists?
Man, homemade political signs, that's like a new concept that could really take off. It's pretty boring, like a sign and some color. How about tell us how you really feel? That would really spice some things up in some neighborhoods. Hey, Isaac?
Yeah. When I was talking with Lindsay on the Daily Brief on Thursday about this, she said Wilson had the most expensive home in Vancouver or in BC there, which is $81 million. So yeah, I just found that interesting. I mean, his sign getting defaced, I don't know how he feels about that, but he then put up a subsequent sign and even a third sign. I heard, I can't remember what they said, but so he's just gonna keep putting up new signs every day. They'll deface them and he'll put a new one up the next day.
Well, I just want to add that, like, the fact that they're defacing private property just goes to prove his point. These people don't care about private property. They feel entitled to other people's private property.
I wish there was a better segue for these stories. That's the other problem, like I feel like back in whenever Andrew Lawton would host the show, he would always have these classic segues. I'm not there yet, but we're gonna just abruptly segue to another story here, and we're gonna ship it over to you, Isaac, to talk about the revelations we are learning about the handling of the Jasper wildfire story. I talked about this on my show yesterday. And it is what we are learning is just disgraceful. The neglect, the negligence, and the handling of this wildfire, which it appears could have been almost entirely prevented. Isaac, what are we learning?
Yeah, tough to segue into this one, Harrison. Obviously, I spent much of my day yesterday for hours watching the testimonies coming out of the House of Commons about the Jasper wildfires. And with every testimony I watched, the feeling of sickness in my stomach grew, knowing now for certain that something is amiss with the way the Jasper wildfire was handled, not only during the fire, but leading up to the fire. So the Conservatives, they're setting forward a motion calling for additional testimony from forest management groups, stakeholders, Indigenous communities, and impacted individuals for 4 additional meetings, because they're saying, look, we've uncovered so much already. We need more time to go through this. It was Dan Mazier, the Conservative MP, who said, quote, over the last 2 weeks, an alarming amount of evidence has been released at the Environment Committee that shows Minister Guilbeault was negligent in protecting Jasper. So obviously we saw Guilbeault was found discussing canceling prescribed burns for, quote, political purposes. This was months before the fire. And again, the fire caused almost $1 billion in damage, destroying a third of Jasper, resulting in over 360 square kilometers of burned or partially burned area and 358 destroyed structures. Mazier said a few other things. He said that Parks Canada officials, which we saw in their testimony, they can't even tell us how many hectares of dead pine remain in Jasper. But fans of True North may remember our exclusive where Peter Schultz said he estimated that last summer about 40% of the forest was standing dead pine, which he said essentially made it a powder keg.
Yeah.
But then something even worse came out, Harrison, which was that we saw in these testimonies firefighters speaking who said, look, we showed up and they sent us away. Yeah, 50 firefighters and 20 fire trucks were turned away by Parks Canada when they arrived in Jasper to help fight the fire. This was during the fire, and they said, no thanks, guys. So yeah, we saw the president of Arctic Fire Safety Services, Christopher Leavam, I don't know how you pronounce that, but he testified that they were deemed non-essential, and yes, Parks Canada ordered them to leave, he said. He also revealed, I mean, the more I go into this, the worse it gets, guys. He also revealed that the hydrants in Jasper are different than every other municipality in Alberta and British Columbia, and they only had 7 available adapters. So these fire trucks were showing up. They can't even connect to the hydrants because for some reason, Parks Canada ordered some weird hydrant that no other municipalities use. So of course the threading is not compatible with the fire trucks. And yeah, that Liveham, he said at one point they were just forced to stand there and watch things burn down because they couldn't connect to the hydrant. So he said something interesting, which was, quote, that this should warrant a deeper investigation into this agency's fire mismanagement and overall role as guardians of Canada's most important and cultural assets. I mean, the list is never ending. The things that I uncovered yesterday, guys, going through these testimonies. I mean, it literally does get worse and worse. The last thing I'll add, I guess, was you let me know the level of corruption you think this is. But at one point, the committee chair stopped Liveham from testifying, said they couldn't interpret his French. But then literally 5 seconds later, someone's testifying and they're interpreting his French. So I'm like, found that kind of odd, but they said, we got to stop you right there. Our interpreters can't interpret you. But then literally 5 seconds later, they're interpreting another guy. So I really don't know what's happening. And we know Guilbeault and Smith, the Alberta premier, have a long history of animosity. So there's really a lot that goes into the story. Who wants to speak about it first?
Well, I find it shocking, of course. Cosman, every time there's a wildfire in this country, especially over the past 3 or 4 years, it's always climate change to blame. It's always climate change, despite the mounting evidence of people who formerly worked in Jasper, from wildfire firefighters, and from forestry experts saying it has nothing to do with that. It's negligence, poor forest management, but obviously it is so conveniently blamed on climate change.
Yeah, I think Canadians need to start asking themselves, at what point does the negligence, mismanagement, incompetence result in real consequences? Because this fire is devastating for the people of Jasper and the surrounding communities. They've lost their homes, businesses, literally everything they based their lives on. And you could argue that the results are a direct consequence of the Liberal government's failure to prevent this from happening, failure to shield this town and protect the people there who were under their care. They had a duty to do that, but they didn't, because they focused on these pie-in-the-sky targets that don't actually manifest. These environmental targets don't actually manifest any real results. Things keep getting burnt up, and they've ignored the real actions that prevent forest fires. Like you said, forest management, equipping firefighters with the right equipment. It's simple. It's just logical things that you have to think of when you're dealing with emergency preparedness. And they've also tanked the forestry industry here in BC. And the forestry industry has a role to play in actually managing forests. They cut down older trees. They remove debris from forests. They plant new, fresh trees. It's ridiculous. And they've taken all these steps for what? Just so that they can get some global clout at the UN and at the COP summits. Meanwhile, the consequences are people's lives ruined, and worse, when people potentially die.
Yeah. So, and not only that, I mean, we're resulting in potential deaths. We're resulting in billions of dollars of damages. We're resulting in one of the crown jewels, one of the natural crown jewels of the world, likely one of the most beautiful natural places in the world, being destroyed. And here's the thing. They always talk about lowering carbon emissions. That's what Trudeau and Guilbeault always talk about. That's why there's a carbon tax. That's why they refuse to fund and support Canada's natural resources industry, because we need to lower our carbon emissions, Isaac. But here's the thing that they don't tell you, that the wildfire season in 2023 Just the wildfires alone, not the oil industry, not cars, not any of else what they say. The wildfires alone emitted more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than all but 3 nations in the world. The 2023 wildfire emitted more carbon than every other country except for China, India, and the United States. So if you wanted to lower carbon emissions in Canada, they could actually do that by preventing forest fires, Isaac.
Yeah, and also don't forests absorb carbon? So when they burn down, pretty much you're losing a net negative as well. So it's a double whammy, if you want to call it that.
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. And then to basically use these policies, use these climate policies, which is what Peter Schultz, a former Jasper Park senior planner, alleged as far back as 2008. So this is a long issue, long time problem, where certain political groups in and around Jasper, right? He blames them and Parks Canada for basically believing that any cutting down of any tree is a crime, that it is like taking a life. So they have allowed these groups, and Parks Canada have been infiltrated by political activists, it appears, and these are not my comments. These are comments from someone who worked at the park, to dictate forest management policies, stopping lumber companies, as you pointed out, Cosman, from clearing out areas of the forest, from actually building what they call fire blocks in the middle of the forest, and from stopping the clearing out of dead wood, the pine beetle that is killing these trees, from stopping that from building up on the forest floor. Like, it's so common sense, but yet we've basically allowed forests to be sacrificed for climate change policies. I can't think of anything worse.
Just to stick on the negligence aspect of this, the vast majority of the negative consequences of the destruction, etc., comes from a lack of preparedness and a lack of actually doing anything to prevent this from happening on the part of government. Here in BC, not too long ago, there was flooding in the Fraser Valley, in Abbotsford, particularly Mission, Chilliwack, that area there. And it was revealed that the government there, both municipal and provincial government, were warned way back years ago, like I think even a decade earlier, that the dikes were not prepared for another major flooding incident, because one happened about half a century prior. So they were aware of this. They didn't do anything to prevent it. Their flood system was not upgraded. It wasn't managed to the degree where it could have prevented much of the damage that happened to farms. And that's the main people who were actually affected by this climate event. But what it actually was, it was a mismanagement event. The government failed people, failed to act, and invested their time in priorities making like climate change emergency declarations instead of actually getting people on the ground, putting up sandbags, reinforcing dikes, creating those floodgates.
We try to end the show with some less serious topics, some more lighthearted topics, but it won't be very lighthearted for Isaac or I, because both of our teams, our hockey teams, had a rough start to the season on Wednesday night. But the news of the NHL season has been completely trumped by the hiring of the first female NHL assistant coach, Jessica Campbell, by the Seattle Kraken. Everybody is going crazy over this because it's so impactful. A first female coach has been hired. Now, we have some disagreement here amongst the True North staff. Some of us believe this is a clear example of DEI getting its way into hockey, a place where it does not belong, and others don't believe so. Isaac, you don't believe the hiring of Jessica Campbell is DEI? I will let you explain.
I don't know. I looked into her history a bit. Obviously, she had various medals, some gold ones from international play, and even more so, she began coaching in 2017. So how long is that? 7 years now. So as the owner of JC Power Skating, her clientele included NHL player Tyson Jost, Stanley Cup champion Joel Edmondson, and Olympic gold medalist Natalie Spooner. So a pretty good list there. And then in July 2022, she was hired as the assistant coach of the Coachella Valley Firebirds, which was the top minor league affiliate of the NHL's Seattle Kraken, for whom she now coaches, or assistant coaches, sorry. She obviously became the first woman to be employed on a full-time basis in the AHL as well. And then, as you mentioned, this week, she became the first female coach to be behind the bench in NHL history. So while I will admit with you and Harrison that DEI may have played a part, because Seattle's like, oh, we're going to hire this woman, it might look good for us. But at the same time, she does have an impressive resume. They didn't just pick some random woman off the street. And we were talking earlier about how Kyle Dubas of the Toronto Maple Leafs may have had an even less impressive resume than her.
I don't know much. Hockey is not my number one sport. I do love watching Hockey Night in Canada, I have to say. I don't follow it very closely, not as close as some others at True North. But I looked into this story, and I see that she has had a rapid rise through the ranks of hockey. Very rapid, likely faster than most male coaches. It says here that in 2021, 2022, she got her job as the assistant coach for the Nuremberg Ice Tigers. And then I guess it would have been within a year and a half later, she's in the AHL. And then the very next season, she's at the NHL. It seems very quick hiring. And another thing I will say, Cosmin, is what gives it away for me about this being DEI is that everybody's going absolutely absurd over this, saying this is so historic. This is the first woman there doing, special segments and videos for it. But if she was completely deserving of it, why bother? Just let it go under the radar and let her just stand on her own 2 feet and let her work show for itself.
Well, look, I'm not a huge hockey expert, but the other thing that's overlooked is this is Seattle, Washington State. This is like one of the most liberal, progressive states on the West Coast. I've been to Seattle. It's actually a dump now. The local government has ruined that city. It's almost as bad, if not more widespread, than Vancouver in terms of their drug addiction issues and crime. I saw a person there. There was an ambulance trying to come through. We were just driving through downtown, and he was pointing like a finger gun at the ambulance in the middle of the crosswalk, and it couldn't pass by him. It is one of the quintessential left-wing radical Antifa places in the entire United States. So I'm not surprised. I'm really not surprised it's coming from Seattle.
Isaac, what do you make of just the general direction of the NHL? We've seen some shocking examples of this DEI woke nonsense. I believe that they held some sort of there was a transgender event that they held, a hockey game about 2 years ago. We've seen all their the Black Lives Matter messaging on the hockey ice. I mean, surely, like all the other sports, this sort of thing should be left off the ice.
Yeah, I remember last year, obviously, we saw that big pushback against pride events in the NHL because so many players were saying, look, we are not participating in this, which led to a bunch of controversy. But that's really what it came down to, Harrison. It's like, we're here to watch hockey. We're here to get away from the politics of everyday life. We just want to watch a sport we love and wind down. Let's focus on the sport, the game. We don't need to bring all of these woke initiatives into it.
It's like a lot of hockey players, we from what we can see, are actually conservatives. They don't believe any of this crazy nonsense. And we kind of know part of that because we have seen through the True North channel some retired NHLers that follow our accounts and follow our work. So we appreciate all those guys for liking what we produce at True North. With that, let's wrap it up. And as I guess the slogan goes, everything you've just heard was off the record. So did the Oilers really lose 6-0, Isaac, or was that slightly?
We have improved because last year we got smoked 8-1. So based on that logic, we got to Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals. I mean, we may never lose again.
There you go. That's some optimism. As our managing editor or managing producer said, that kind of optimism is Maple Leafs level optimism, I have to say.